Back in the 1970s, one of my dad's closest friends was a judge in the South Bronx who was nicknamed Two Gun. And he was nicknamed Two Gun because he carried two guns because he felt it was his only way to keep safe in his role as a judge. Now, why do I bring that up? Because the New York Times just did a massive piece on judges and the threats to their safety and the fact that law enforcement is pretty much powerless to do this because law enforcement works after the fact. And the upshot of the article was more and more judges are carrying guns for their own safety because they feel like they have nothing else they can do. But is that really the most effective strategy to avoid physical harm when you're a judge? I think there's more that you can do. And I know because I've actually trained judges, court administrators, court staff, and the staff of a U.S. senator whose staff members face constant threats because of their role in political. Now, I've also worked a lot with attorneys, and in a way you could almost call this lawyers, guns, and money because most judges are lawyers. But essentially, what you really have to think about when you think about safety is what will actually work for your specific safety situations. And in this piece, we're going to go ahead and look at why a gun isn't necessarily your best option if you're a legal professional. And that includes lawyers. Approximately 40% of all lawyers surveyed have faced threats or actual physical violence. So this piece will cover that too. Hi, I'm Mike Corwin, and if you're a California organization who has put together a workplace violence prevention program and you want to see if you're in compliance with California law, I'd love to do a 15-minute free consultation with you. We'll discuss where you're at and we'll talk about whether you've actually achieved that goal of creating a compliant plan that will also keep your employees safe. And if not, I'll give you some ideas on what you can do. Just click on the link in the description below. So here's the problem with relying on a gun as your primary basis for your strategies to avoid physical harm from workplace violence. Now, judges face workplace violence because of the work they do, because of the political culture that is targeting judges, but a lot of the threats they face are actually at their home. And you may remember a few years back when a federal judge's husband was shot at their home. And recently in Indiana, a judge and his wife got into a gunfight at their home with an attacker. So it's not just in the workplace. Here's a couple of things that you should consider if you are thinking about using a firearm as your primary strategy to avoid physical harm. Now, by the way, California mandates you must train your employees in strategies to avoid physical harm from violence, and they must be specific to the safety hazards your employees face. Now, number one, with a gun, and you have to think about this for any weapon you carry can be taken from you and used against you. And I know that because I've taught many people how to do exactly that. So if you have a firearm, you can't just brandish it at someone and hope that you intimidate them because they can very easily take that gun from you. The second thing to remember is that bullets can go through drywall and other surfaces, and an innocent person may be injured or worse, killed, and that can fall on you. So you have to really think about that. And then the third thing is if you carry a firearm, and as I mentioned, you can't just brandish it, you've got to actually pull it out and pull the trigger in order for it to be effective. And that's a judgment call you have to make in a split second. You don't have minutes to make that decision. You literally have to pull that firearm out and pull the trigger, because if you don't, it will be taken from you. Here's what I do when I work with judges and attorneys and others in the legal field in terms of strategies to avoid physical harm. The first and most important thing is situational awareness, because that's where your safety starts. The sooner you're aware of a potential threat, the more that you can implement different approaches to address that threat, and in fact, you can even avoid that threat. One of the issues going on with judges is they're receiving a ton of online threats. Now, in all fairness, and for the judges and for law enforcement who often does not take any action because of this, there's a little bit of a First Amendment right to be able to talk about a public figure, to be angry at a public figure, to disagree with the public figure. So it's really a fine line of when that transitions into a threat that an action can be taken. So with situational awareness, it's implementing that into your daily life, not just your workplace, but into your daily life. It's recognizing the potential for a safety threat, and that is what gives you options. If you think about it, early awareness equals options equals safety. Now, some of the safety might be simple things like perhaps changing your route to work, parking at a different location, communicating with other people that you have some concerns, and we'll get a little bit more into that. But the single most important thing, and by the way, the judges by and large don't receive more than 1 day of security training, if they even receive that. And I know I butted heads with the local sheriff's department when we were trying to put together trainings for judges and court administrators in Bernalillo County back in New Mexico, because of the fact that the sheriff said, we've got this, you guys don't have to do anything. That's not how the judges felt, and the judges simply felt they needed more, and that's what we provided. Now, the next thing obviously is de-escalation, but you have to understand the way violence works. Violence does not follow a set progression. It happens, and it can happen at any point. And from that, you may not have time to de-escalate. But there are some things you can do, like reading body language, listening, redirecting the person's thought process, that can help you. And if you do de-escalate, then you've got to be able to continue with that and make that fully safe. But understand that there are times you may not be able to de-escalate because quite simply something happens before you have a chance. Now, I call this changing the dynamics of an attack. When an attack initiates, you've got to take away the attacker's initial advantage. And to do that, there are a couple of different approaches, but primarily it involves distraction techniques, and it involves forcing the attacker to recalculate and recalibrate the attack. There's a couple different ways that you do that. One of the ways is by creating physical barriers, for example, getting on the other side of a vehicle, going behind a door. Those are physical barriers, and it makes them have to move around and work around and come up with a new plan. The other thing that you can do is partly de-escalation, where you can use their thought process and redirect it. And then another component of that is actually self-defense. And self-defense is also its own separate component. But if you can stop an attack, or you can take an attacker's gun away, or you can prevent yourself from being put on the ground right away, that does force the attacker to recalibrate. And while the attacker is recalibrating, you create chances and opportunities for yourself to either take control of the situation or to exit the situation quickly and safely. A couple other things that are really critical, and that's communication. You've got to be able to communicate when you have safety concerns. You've also got to be able to communicate when you need someone to come in and help you, and that leads to the buddy system. So for example, if judges are working at a courthouse or lawyers are working at their law firm, if you're staying a little later, you should have someone who can go to your car with you, because if you think about it, if somebody knows where you work and they know where you park and they have a pretty good idea of your schedule, they can actually lay in wait for you. So having that buddy system in place is a really important tool to help you in that, a really important strategy to avoid physical harm. When you are dealing with determining the best strategies to avoid physical harm, you really need to assess what your safety risks are, what your safety hazards are. That's pretty critical, and it should, if you're in the legal profession, it should also include your staff. But Understand where your threats are coming from and how they can manifest themselves, because that's going to guide you to the most important and most useful strategies to avoid physical harm. The other thing is understanding the power of training and repetition. So for example, when I work with some folks, I also provide access to some video content for them so that they can continue to work on this and practice, because a one and done might not necessarily get you there. It's a good start, but you will need some additional work, and that's one of the things that I provide. If you would like some help determining if your workplace violence prevention program complies with California's new law, I'd love to do a 15-minute free conversation with you. We'll discuss where your program is at. We'll look at some possibilities that you can add. If they need to be strengthened, they might be totally fine. And if they are, that's great. You go on. If not, I'll point out some areas that you can strengthen your plan with to bring it into compliance. Because remember, it's not just about complying with the law, it's also about keeping your people safe. And if you want to schedule a free consultation, just click on the link in the description below.